The pencil-thin woman pressed her skeletal frame against the wooden barrack wall, whispering a prayer she no longer believed God could hear. April 11th, 1945, Buchenwald concentration camp. Through the gaps in the planking, she could see American soldiers moving through the compound, and she knew with absolute certainty that they had come to kill her. Before we go further, pause for just a moment and tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your part of the world. If this story moves you, hit that like button and subscribe so we can keep bringing you these forgotten moments of history. This is the story of the most profound misunderstanding in modern warfare, where mercy met terror and changed everything. The sound reached the women's barracks before the sight, not the familiar crack of German rifles or the guttural shouts of SS guards, but something else entirely. The rumble of diesel engines, the metallic clank of tank treads on frozen mud, voices speaking English, sharp and urgent, cutting through the morning air that still carried the stench of death. Inside Barracks 14, approximately 300 women huddled together in a space designed for 60. Their bodies pressed against each other for warmth, for comfort, for the illusion of protection. Most wore the same filthy striped uniforms they had worn for months, the fabric stiff with dirt and body fluids. Lice crawled freely through their hair, open sores wept through the thin cloth. Frau Margareta Klein, a 38-year-old teacher from Munich who looked 70, had survived Buchenwald for 2 years. She later wrote in testimony given to the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, "We heard the Americans were coming and we were certain it meant execution. Why would they spare us? We were witnesses to crimes. We knew too much." This belief was not paranoia. It was the product of systematic psychological destruction. For years, Nazi guards had whispered promises into the darkness of the barracks. When the Allies come, they will finish what we started. The Americans hate you more than we do. The British will burn you alive for what has happened here. These words had burrowed into minds already fractured by starvation, disease, and daily brutality. The mathematics of death at Buchenwald told a story that defied human comprehension. By April 1945, more than 50,000 prisoners were crammed into a camp built for 8,000. The death rate in the final months exceeded 200 per day. Bodies were stacked like cordwood outside the crematorium, waiting their turn. The living stepped over the dead to reach the latrines. Children played near corpses because there was nowhere else to play. The smell defined everything. Every survivor would remember it for the rest of their lives. The sweet rot stench of decomposing flesh mixed with human waste, unwashed bodies, and the acrid smoke from the crematorium that never stopped burning. American soldiers who liberated the camp would describe it as a physical force, something that hit you like a wall when you were still a quarter-mile away. It soaked into uniforms, into skin, into memory, but on this morning the smell was joined by something new: diesel fuel. Clean wool from American uniforms, the sharp tang of disinfectant powder. Technical Sergeant Mike O'Donnell of the 6th Armored Division was among the first through the main gate. His diary entry, preserved at the National World War II Museum, recorded what he could barely process. "Nothing in 3 years of combat prepared me for what I saw. The things walking toward us didn't look like people. They looked like skeletons wrapped in skin, moving because they didn't know they should be dead." In the women's barracks, the sound of approaching boots triggered panic. Some women began to pray, Jews reciting the Shema, Catholics clutching invisible rosaries, atheists finding God in their final moments. Others simply wept, too exhausted for anything else. A few attempted to hide, crawling under bunks or pressing themselves into corners as if wooden walls could protect them from what was coming. 22-year-old Rachel Lieberman from Warsaw had already watched her entire family die. Her mother in the gas chambers at Auschwitz, her father shot during the Warsaw Ghetto uprising. Her 2 younger sisters had died of typhus in Buchenwald just 3 weeks earlier. She had nothing left to lose, which made her brave enough to look through the gaps in the wall. What she saw confused her. American soldiers were moving through the compound, but they weren't shooting. They were calling out in German, in Yiddish, in broken Polish. Their weapons were lowered. Some had removed their helmets. A few were crying. One soldier approached the crematorium, saw what was inside, and vomited into the mud. Another knelt beside a pile of bodies and simply sat there, staring, his rifle forgotten in his lap. A chaplain stood in the parade ground with his arms spread wide, his mouth moving in silent prayer or shock. Rachel couldn't tell which. The barrack door suddenly swung open. 3 American soldiers stood in the threshold, their size enormous compared to the skeletal women inside. For a moment, nobody moved. The soldiers' faces showed horror, pity, and something else that Rachel couldn't quite identify. The women pressed back against the far wall, some whimpering, others too weak even to cry. Then one of the soldiers did something unexpected. He removed his helmet, held it against his chest, and spoke in careful, accented German. "You are safe now. The war is over for you. We are Americans. We have food. We have medicine. Please, let us help you." The women didn't believe him. How could they? In a universe where children were murdered and corpses were burned and humanity meant nothing, mercy was the most dangerous lie of all. But the soldier didn't leave. He knelt down, a gesture so unexpected that several women gasped. He was lowering himself, making himself vulnerable, showing deference to prisoners. This violated every rule they had learned about power. Another soldier entered, carrying something wrapped in canvas. He unwrapped it carefully, revealing U.S. Army ration tins. The smell of real food, meat, bread, chocolate, cut through the barracks stench. He opened a tin and held it out with both hands, like an offering. Still, nobody moved. The psychological damage ran too deep. Frau Klein would later explain, "We had seen too much. We trusted nothing. We expected this was a test. That anyone who reached for the food would be shot, or that the food was poisoned, or that accepting help would mean something worse." Outside, more soldiers were arriving. Medical teams with Red Cross armbands, engineers with equipment, chaplains, journalists with cameras. The camp was filling with Americans, and none of them were shooting. Mercy wore an American uniform, but inside Barracks 14, 300 women still believed they were about to die. They had survived years of systematic destruction only to face their final test, whether to accept rescue from people they had been taught to fear or to die in place, trusting nothing. The first soldier continued to kneel, the food tin still extended in his hands. His eyes were wet. He spoke again, this time in Yiddish, words his grandmother had taught him in Brooklyn. "Wir seinen du zu helfen." We are here to help. Rachel Lieberman recognized the language. She understood the words. But understanding and believing were different things entirely. The moment stretched out, suspended between terror and hope, between everything these women had learned about human cruelty and the impossible suggestion that salvation had arrived. What happened in the next 30 seconds would determine whether 300 women died of fear in their moment of liberation. The tin of food trembled in the soldier's outstretched hands, not from his nervousness, but from the vibration of his heartbeat transmitted through fingers that had held rifles for 3 years. And now held hope. This was the fulcrum moment where history could tip toward tragedy or redemption. Then a sound broke the silence. Not a scream or a sob, but something more animal, a low moan of hunger that came from somewhere in the back of the barracks. A woman who was too far gone to remember fear, only need. She crawled forward on hands and knees, her skeletal fingers scraping against the wooden floor with a sound like dry sticks clicking together. The soldier didn't move. Didn't rush her, didn't stand up and tower over her. He simply waited, kneeling, the food still offered. Her hand, nothing but bone and parchment skin, reached out and touched the tin. Real, solid, not a hallucination. She pulled it toward herself with a strength that shocked everyone, including herself, and began eating with her fingers, shoving the food into her mouth so fast she choked. The soldier gently touched her shoulder. "Slowly," he said in German. "Langsam. Too fast will make you sick." But the dam had broken. Other women began moving forward, some crawling, some supported by others. The fear hadn't vanished. It never would. But hunger proved stronger than terror. The 3 soldiers had perhaps 30 ration tins between them. It wasn't nearly enough for 300 women, but they distributed what they had with a careful equality that surprised the prisoners. Each woman received exactly the same amount. No favorites, no bribes demanded, no violence. This equity was itself revolutionary. Outside the barracks, the scale of the liberation was overwhelming the American 6th Armored Division. They had expected to find perhaps a few thousand prisoners. Instead, they discovered more than 21,000 still alive, with thousands more already dead and awaiting burial. The camp sprawled across multiple acres, a complex of wooden barracks, brick buildings, and open parade grounds now churned to mud by April rains. Captain James McBride, a medical officer from Ohio, established a triage station in what had been the camp's main assembly area. His after-action report, filed 3 days later, detailed the impossible mathematics of mass salvation. "We have approximately 200 medical personnel to treat over 20,000 patients in various stages of starvation, disease, and injury. We are losing patients we could save if we had adequate supplies. Typhus is epidemic. We need everything." The U.S. Army responded with stunning speed. Within 18 hours, additional medical units arrived from rear areas. Supply trucks carrying plasma, sulfur drugs, bandages, and DDT delousing powder began rolling through the gates. Field kitchens were established to produce thin soups, the only food safe for stomachs that had forgotten how to digest. Engineers constructed temporary hospitals in empty SS barracks, evicting the German guards who had fled during the chaos of liberation. Death and rescue walked hand in hand. Even as soldiers carried survivors to medical care, others died in their arms. The human body can only endure so much, and for many, liberation came days or hours too late. Private First Class Robert Chen of the 522nd Field Artillery Battalion, a Japanese-American unit that had fought its way through Italy and France, later testified that he held a young woman who died as he carried her to an ambulance. "She smiled at me," he said. "Then she just stopped breathing, like she had permission to die now that someone was trying to help." Back in Barracks 14, the distribution of food had created a new problem. Several women who had eaten the rich American rations too quickly began vomiting. Others developed severe diarrhea. Their bodies, adapted to starvation rations of perhaps 300 calories daily, couldn't process real food. This refeeding syndrome would kill dozens in the first week of liberation, survival stolen by abundance. But the American medical teams learned fast. By day 2, they had established strict feeding protocols. Thin broths first, small portions every 2 hours, gradual introduction of solid foods over weeks. It was frustrating for soldiers who wanted to help immediately, who saw starving people and wanted to give them everything, but discipline saved lives. The woman who had first accepted food from the kneeling soldier was named Dvora Berkowitz. She was 29 years old, though she looked 60. Before the war, she had been a seamstress in Krakow, married with 2 children. The children were dead, gassed at Auschwitz. Her husband shot during a selection. She had survived 18 months of systematic destruction, and now sat on the floor of Barracks 14, with an empty ration tin in her lap and tears streaming down her face. A soldier, the same one who had first offered food, sat down beside her, not across from her in a position of authority, but beside her as an equal. He pulled out a photograph from his wallet, his own children, a boy and a girl, smiling in front of a White House in Pennsylvania. "You will live," he told her in careful German. "You will remember your children. You will go home." Dvora didn't believe him. How could she? Home was gone. Everyone was gone. But the soldier's certainty planted a seed of possibility in a mind that had known only death. Throughout the camp, similar scenes unfolded in countless variations. Soldiers lifting prisoners who couldn't walk, carrying them on their backs or in their arms to medical stations. Engineers using bulldozers to dig proper graves for the dead, replacing the mass pits with individual burials when possible. Chaplains organizing religious services, finding rabbis among the survivors to say Kaddish over the dead. The sound of Buchenwald changed that day. The crack of rifle fire and the screams of the tortured were replaced by diesel engines, American voices calling for medics, the rumble of supply trucks, and, most startling, laughter. Hysteria laughter, perhaps. Or the laughter of people whose minds had fractured, but laughter nonetheless. Some prisoners laughed until they cried. Others cried until they laughed. The line between the two became meaningless. In Barracks 14, more soldiers arrived with blankets, real wool blankets from U.S. Army stores. They distributed them to women who hadn't felt clean fabric in years. Some wrapped themselves immediately, others just held the blankets, touching the texture, smelling the newness, unable to process this basic dignity. Private Thomas Walsh from Boston approached a group of women in the corner who hadn't moved forward for food. They were the most terrified, or the most sick. He couldn't tell which. He knelt down. This gesture of kneeling would be repeated thousands of times across the camp in the first hours, and spoke in broken German. "We carry you. Medicine, doctor, you safe?" The women stared at him. One shook her head violently. Another tried to push herself further into the corner. They still didn't believe. Still expected the trick, the betrayal, the final cruelty. Walsh did something then that would echo through decades of testimony. He took off his heavy combat jacket and wrapped it around the nearest woman's shoulders. Then he lifted her, she weighed perhaps 60 pounds, and carried her out of the barracks into the April sunlight. The other women watched through the open door. They saw him walk carefully across the muddy parade ground. They saw him hand her gently to medics. They saw him return. Protection meant risk taken for strangers. He came back for another, then another. Other soldiers joined him. They formed a relay, carrying women from the barracks to the medical station. Some women were so weak they couldn't hold on, their arms dangling. Some cried, some remained silent, but they were carried. This was the image that would haunt American soldiers for the rest of their lives. The impossible lightness of human beings reduced to near skeletons, the fragility of bone under skin, the terrible responsibility of carrying lives that had been systematically destroyed by organized hatred, and now depended entirely on organized mercy. In the camp hospital, hastily established in a former SS administration building, Dr. Meyer Rosenthal, a Jewish refugee from Berlin who had escaped to America in '38 and joined the Army Medical Corps, worked without stopping. He spoke German, Yiddish, and Polish. He could explain procedures, calm fears, and bridge the gap between the liberators and the liberated. But even he struggled with the scope of suffering. Typhus had spread through the camp like wildfire in the final months. Prisoners showed symptoms of severe dehydration, gangrene, tuberculosis, and conditions that had no names. Some had injuries from beatings that had never healed. Others bore the scars of medical experiments conducted by SS doctors. The work was impossible, and yet it happened. Hour by hour, patient by patient, the machinery of American military medicine ground forward, processing the unprocessable, treating the untreatable, saving those who could be saved, and bearing witness to those who couldn't. Night fell on April 11, 1945. The camp was now lit by American generators, electric lights blazing across a compound that had existed in darkness. In Barracks 14, women lay wrapped in army blankets, their stomachs cramping from unaccustomed food, their minds struggling to comprehend what had happened. Dvora Berkowitz sat near the window, looking out at American soldiers standing guard, not over them as prisoners, but around them as protectors. The distinction was everything. Tomorrow would bring new horrors, the discovery of mass graves, the documentation of crimes, the realization that thousands were too sick to save. But tonight, for the first time in years, the women of Barracks 14 slept without certain knowledge that tomorrow meant death. Yet the psychological war was far from over. Trust, once shattered, doesn't reassemble in a day. The camera shutter clicked in rapid succession, each exposure burning images onto film that would become evidence, memory, and warning for generations yet unborn. April 12, 1945, the second day of liberation revealed what darkness had hidden. Signal Corps photographers moved through Buchenwald with professional detachment that barely masked their horror. Sergeant Arlen Musser from Indiana photographed piles of corpses stacked like cordwood near the crematorium. Corporal James Etheridge documented emaciated prisoners pointing to the ovens where their friends had burned. Lieutenant Arnold Samuelson filmed the boxcars found at the nearby rail siding. 46 cars packed with bodies in various stages of decomposition, a death train that had arrived too late to complete its journey. These weren't propaganda images, they were legal documentation. General Dwight D. Eisenhower had issued explicit orders 3 days earlier after visiting the Ohrdruf subcamp. Get it all on record now, get the films, get the witnesses, because somewhere down the road of history, some bastard will get up and say that this never happened. But documentation meant survivors had to relive their trauma for cameras, for journalists, for military investigators. They had to point to places where friends died, describe procedures in the medical experiment blocks, identify SS guards from photographs, testify about atrocities, while their own bodies still bore the evidence. Rachel Lieberman found herself standing before an American officer with a translator, trying to explain how her sisters had died. The officer took notes with mechanical precision, his face carefully neutral. When she finished, he thanked her for her courage. She wondered what courage had to do with survival. She had simply refused to die when dying would have been easier. The medical crisis deepened as typhus continued its harvest. Despite aggressive delousing with DDT powder, survivors standing naked while Americans sprayed white chemical clouds over their bodies and through their hair, the disease spread. Field hospitals established in former SS barracks filled beyond capacity. Medics worked around the clock, fighting an epidemic with inadequate supplies and overwhelmed by the sheer numbers. Dr. Meyer Rosenthal wrote in his diary on April 13th, "We are losing approximately 40 patients per day despite our best efforts. The typhus is complicated by starvation damage to internal organs, tuberculosis, and in many cases a psychological collapse where patients simply stop fighting to live." How do you treat someone who has survived hell only to discover that everyone they loved is dead? Survival demanded reasons to live. In Barracks 14, Frau Margareta Klein had taken on an unofficial role as interpreter and organizer. Her German was educated, her French passable, and she had picked up enough Yiddish and Polish to communicate with most women. She helped American medical staff understand who needed urgent care, who had family to search for, who spoke which languages. This work gave her purpose. Purpose gave her a reason to wake up each morning. She had lost her husband, her 2 sons, and her faith in humanity, but she could still translate. She could still help. On April 14th, something unprecedented happened. Under orders from the American military government, the mayor of Weimar and approximately 1,000 German civilians from the nearby city were marched to Buchenwald and forced to tour the camp. The civilians came dressed in their Sunday best. Clean coats, polished shoes, hats and gloves. They walked through the main gate under the infamous slogan, "Jedem das Sein," to each what he deserves, and confronted what had existed 5 miles from their homes for 7 years. Sergeant Michael Hirsch, a Jewish refugee from Vienna who had escaped to America in '39 and returned as a U.S. Army translator, walked with the civilian groups. His report captured their reactions with clinical precision. Most claimed complete ignorance. "We didn't know," they repeated like a liturgy. Some turned away from the corpses, others vomited. A few women fainted and had to be carried out, but several, notably older men and a few middle-aged women, showed expressions that suggested they had always known, or at least suspected, and had chosen comfortable ignorance. The survivors watched these tours with mixed emotions. Some felt vindication, finally witnesses to the truth. Others felt rage that these people had lived normal lives while horror existed in their backyard. A few felt nothing at all, too exhausted for emotion. One German woman, perhaps 50 years old, stood near the crematorium and wept openly. She approached a group of survivors through a translator and said, "I did not know. I am sorry. I am so sorry." Her words hung in the air, inadequate and perhaps insincere, but spoken nonetheless. What would you do if you discovered your neighbors had been complicit in murder? If the shopkeeper who sold you bread had known children were being gassed 5 miles away? Would you accept their claims of ignorance or demand accountability? The question had no easy answers. Some survivors wanted revenge, others wanted only to leave and never return. Most occupied a gray space between, too broken to care about justice, too traumatized to forget injustice. By mid-April, the American military government began the massive task of repatriation and resettlement. Where would these survivors go? Poland was under Soviet control, Germany was in ruins. Many survivors discovered their homes had been occupied by neighbors who refused to leave, their possessions were gone, their communities were destroyed, displaced. Persons' camps were established, temporary cities for people who had nowhere else to go. But even these camps, run with American efficiency and humanitarian intent, felt like continued imprisonment to people who had promised themselves they would never live behind wire again. Dvora Berkowitz received notification through Red Cross channels that her hometown of Krakow had been liberated by the Soviets months earlier. She could request repatriation, but return to what? Her home was gone, her family was dead, Poland was controlled by a regime she didn't trust. She had survived, but she had nowhere to survive to. This was the hidden tragedy within the liberation: freedom without destination, survival without purpose. Medical staff could treat disease, engineers could bury the dead. But no one could restore what had been taken: families, homes, futures. The fundamental belief that the world was a place where people could be safe. In the second week after liberation, an American chaplain named Rabbi Herschel Schachter arrived at Buchenwald. He was a U.S. Army captain, but also an ordained rabbi from the Bronx. He organized the first formal Jewish religious service held in the camp since its creation in 1937. More than 1,000 survivors attended. They stood or sat, many too weak to stand for long, while Rabbi Schachter led prayers. When he began the Kaddish, the prayer for the dead, the sound of hundreds of voices joining in unison created a moment of such profound grief and defiance that even hardened soldiers wept. Among those present was a 16-year-old boy named Eliezer Weisel. He would later write about that moment, and many others, in a memoir called Night, capturing the sensory shock of liberation in words that would become some of the most quoted in Holocaust literature. "Never shall I forget that night, the first night in camp which has turned my life into one long night." But that was later. In April 1945, he was simply one of thousands of boys who had survived but lost their childhoods to organized evil. Memory began while trauma continued. The American soldiers who liberated Buchenwald carried their own burdens home. Many couldn't speak about what they had seen for decades. They suffered nightmares, intrusive memories, what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. They had entered the camp as liberators and left as witnesses to humanity's capacity for industrialized cruelty. Private Thomas Walsh, who had carried women from barracks 14 to medical care, wrote to his mother in Boston on April 20th, "I can't describe what I've seen. I don't think I'll ever be able to explain it. All I can say is that I understand now why we're fighting this war, and I understand that it had to be fought. Some things are worth dying to stop." As April turned to May, the camp began to transform. The dead were buried in proper graves. The sick received ongoing treatment. The strong enough to work began helping with camp operations. A makeshift school was established for child survivors. A theater group formed to perform Yiddish plays. Life, stubborn and improbable, reasserted itself. But Buchenwald was only one camp. Dachau was liberated on April 29th by the 45th Infantry Division, which discovered approximately 32,000 prisoners and dozens of boxcars filled with corpses. Bergen-Belsen, liberated by the British on April 15th, held 60,000 prisoners in conditions so apocalyptic that 13,000 died after liberation despite medical care. The scale of the Holocaust was emerging piece by piece, camp by camp, testimony by testimony. Millions dead, thousands of camps, an entire civilization destroyed, numbers that exceeded comprehension. For the women of Barracks 14, this knowledge came slowly. They learned that Auschwitz had been worse, that Treblinka had existed solely for murder, that millions of Jews had been killed in gas chambers disguised as showers, while the world fought a war and looked away. Some broke under this knowledge, others hardened, most simply endured, adding new grief to old, stacking trauma upon trauma, until feeling anything became impossible. Yet in the midst of horror, small moments of grace appeared like flowers in ruins. Sunlight cut across the muddy parade ground of Buchenwald on May 8, 1945, illuminating prisoners wrapped in American blankets who were too weak to appreciate that the war in Europe had officially ended. Victory meant different things to different people, but for survivors, peace was not relief but the beginning of reckoning. The camp remained operational for months after liberation, transformed from a death factory into a displaced persons facility. Barbed wire still surrounded the compound, guard towers still stood. But American soldiers had replaced SS guards, and the gates now stayed open. Survivors could leave whenever they chose, though most had nowhere to go. Dvora Berkowitz remained at Buchenwald until July. She had gained 11 pounds under medical supervision, carefully monitored feeding that brought her from 63 pounds to 74. Her body was recovering. Her mind was another matter. She would wake screaming most nights, trapped in dreams where liberation had been a trick, where Americans suddenly became SS guards, where mercy revealed itself as the cruelest deception of all. The medical staff called it survivor's neurosis. Today we would recognize it as severe PTSD. Then they had no treatment beyond patience and time. In June, she received devastating confirmation through Red Cross channels. Her entire extended family, parents, siblings, aunts, uncles, cousins, had been murdered. 23 people reduced to ash and memory. She was the last, the sole survivor of a bloodline that had existed in Poland for 400 years. This knowledge, which she had expected and dreaded in equal measure, broke something fundamental. For 3 days she refused food, refused to speak, simply sat and stared at the wall of the displaced persons barracks. The American medical staff debated forced feeding. Dr. Rosenthal argued against it. She needs to choose life, he said. We can't choose it for her. On the fourth day, Frau Margareta Klein sat down beside Dvora and spoke in German. Not as a therapist, there were no therapists, but as one survivor to another. They won. The Nazis won. If we die now, every survivor who gives up hands them another victory. I don't have answers. I don't have hope. But I have spite. I will live because they wanted me dead. I will survive because they meant me to perish. That's enough for today. Spite was an ugly motivation. But it worked. Dvora began eating again, not because she wanted to live, but because she refused to let murder be the final word. This pattern repeated thousands of times across Europe in the months after liberation, survivors choosing life not out of hope, but out of defiance, building futures not because they believed in tomorrow, but because they refused to grant victory to those who had tried to destroy them. Survival became resistance. By autumn 1945, most Buchenwald survivors had been relocated to displaced persons camps across Germany and Austria. These facilities, operated by the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration with American military support, housed hundreds of thousands of people, Jews, political prisoners, Roma, homosexuals, and others who had been targeted for destruction. The camps were not concentration camps, but they were still camps, clean, well-supplied, humanitarian in intent, but still surrounded by wire, still administered by authorities, still places where people waited for someone else to decide their futures. Many survivors applied for immigration to Palestine, America, Britain, anywhere that would take them. But the world that had failed to stop the Holocaust now proved reluctant to absorb its survivors. Immigration quotas remained restrictive. Countries claimed they couldn't accommodate large numbers of refugees. Survivors found themselves trapped in bureaucratic limbo, freed from death camps, but confined to waiting. Rachel Lieberman was among those who eventually reached Palestine in 1947. Traveling on a refugee ship that nearly sank in a storm, she would live until 2009, raising 3 children in Israel, never speaking about the war except once, to give videotaped testimony to Yad Vashem when she was 70 years old. In that testimony, she said something that captured the complicated legacy of liberation. "The Americans saved my life. I am grateful beyond words. But they could not save what made life worth living. My family was gone, my world was gone, I survived, but I was a ghost in a world that had moved on without me. It took decades to become real again. The American soldiers who liberated the camps carried their own burdens home." Private Thomas Walsh returned to Boston, in November 1945 and never spoke about Buchenwald to his family. His grandson would discover his grandfather's role only when going through papers after Walsh's death in 1991. Among those papers was a single photograph, a young woman's face, skeletal and haunting, looking directly at the camera with eyes that held more knowledge than any person should possess. On the back, in Walsh's handwriting, "I carried her to safety. I never learned her name. I pray she survived." Thousands of soldiers had similar experiences. They had witnessed the absolute worst of humanity and responded with the best. They had carried strangers, fed enemies, shown mercy when brutality would have been understandable, and they carried the weight of those moments for the rest of their lives. Technical Sergeant Mike O'Donnell, who had been among the first through Buchenwald's gates, committed suicide in 1953. His wife found a note that mentioned the camp, the faces, the smell he could never forget. The army classified his death as service-related, a quiet acknowledgement that liberation had exacted its own casualties, but there were also stories of unexpected grace. Dr. Meyer Rosenthal continued his medical practice in New York after the war and maintained correspondence with 17 former Buchenwald patients. Several visited him over the years. One woman brought her children to meet the American doctor who saved Mama. These connections, spanning decades and oceans, testified to bonds forged in extremity. Frau Margaret Klein eventually emigrated to Canada in 1949 and became a teacher again, educating immigrant children in Toronto. She married a fellow survivor in 1952, not a love match, but a partnership of shared trauma and mutual understanding. They had one child, a daughter, born when Margaret was 42. She named her Sarah after one of the women who had died in Barracks 14 during Liberation Week. The camp itself became a memorial. In 1958, the East German government established the Buchenwald Memorial, preserving the site as a warning against fascism. After reunification, the memorial was redesigned to acknowledge all victims, not just political prisoners. Today, approximately 500,000 people visit annually, walking through the same gates, seeing the same barracks, confronting the same questions about human nature. What the visitors don't see are the invisible scars. The nightmares that haunted survivors for decades, the children who grew up with parents who couldn't explain their tattooed numbers or their reflexive terror at certain sounds, the cascading trauma that passed through generations like a genetic inheritance. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't formally recognized until 1980, 35 years after liberation. By then, many survivors had lived their entire adult lives with untreated psychological wounds, told to move on or be grateful you survived by a world uncomfortable with prolonged suffering. Yet despite everything, the trauma, the loss, the world's inadequate response, survivors built lives. They married, raised families, started businesses, created art, wrote books, taught lessons. They testified at war crimes trials, giving voice to the dead. They established memorials, ensuring remembrance. They transformed victimhood into witness. Dvora Berkowitz eventually remarried in 1955, a widower from Lodz, who had also lost everything. They emigrated to America and settled in Chicago, where Dvora worked as a seamstress, the same profession she had practiced before the war. She had 2 daughters. She told them nothing about Buchenwald until they were adults. In 1985, 40 years after liberation, she returned to Buchenwald as part of a survivor delegation. She walked through the gates, saw Barracks 14, now a museum exhibit, and wept for the first time in decades. An American veteran was also visiting that day, part of a Liberator reunion tour. They didn't speak the same language. But when he saw her striped uniform photograph on her identification badge, he stepped forward and embraced her. 2 strangers connected by a single moment in April 1945 when mercy had interrupted murder and changed everything. The story of liberation is not a simple tale of good triumphing over evil. It is more complex and more human than that. It is about soldiers who saw horror and responded with compassion despite having every excuse for hatred. It is about survivors who chose life when death would have been easier. It is about the stubborn persistence of humanity even in conditions designed to destroy it. The women who expected execution and received rescue carried that moment with them forever. Some with gratitude, some with guilt for surviving when others didn't. Some with a complicated mixture of both. The soldiers who offered mercy instead of vengeance carried their own burdens. The knowledge that they had arrived too late for millions, that liberation came when the damage was already done. They saved who they could and mourned who they couldn't. On April 11, 2025, 80 years after liberation, Buchenwald will hold a memorial ceremony. There will be speeches by politicians, performances by musicians, tours for schoolchildren, but there will be very few survivors. Age has accomplished what the Nazis could not: claiming the last witnesses to an event that must nevertheless never be forgotten. The lesson of Buchenwald is not simply that evil exists, though it does. It is that in the face of absolute evil, ordinary people can choose extraordinary mercy, that soldiers exhausted from 3 years of war can still find the strength to carry skeletal strangers to safety, that humanity can reassert itself even in places designed to destroy it. The women of Barracks 14 expected death and received life. They expected cruelty and received compassion. They expected nothing and were given everything that remained possible: food, medicine, protection, and the chance to rebuild from ruins. It wasn't enough. It could never be enough. But it was mercy offered freely when vengeance would have been understandable. And in that mercy lay a different kind of victory, not over the Nazis who had already lost the war, but over the darkness they had tried to make permanent. The pencil-thin woman who pressed against the barrack wall in terror on April 11, 1945, lived to see her grandchildren. The soldier who knelt to offer food lived to tell his own children about the day he learned what courage really meant. They were connected forever by a moment that proved mercy was not weakness, but the truest strength. In the end, they carried each other, survivors carrying memory forward, liberators carrying witness home, both bearing the weight of a truth the world must never forget. When given the choice, some chose mercy.